I'm Bryan Post, and this is Win the Day with James Whittaker.
You're listening to Win the Day with James Whittaker.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.
Broadcasting from Los Angeles, California. Here's your host, James Whittaker.
Let's go!
Hey winners, welcome back to Win the Day. The quote for this episode comes from Mother Teresa and says, "Love begins by taking care of the closest ones, the ones at home." Bryan Post is one of America's foremost experts on child behavior and adoption. As someone who was both adopted and a foster child, Bryan brings a unique perspective to the challenges families face and the solutions that truly work. Through his groundbreaking, love-based, family-centered principles, Bryan has empowered over 1 million parents and professionals around the world. With 12 books, countless lectures, and decades of experience, he's become a trusted voice in helping families navigate emotional and behavioral struggles with compassion and connection. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to recognize and address unresolved trauma in children, the most effective ways to discipline a child while building trust, how to motivate teenagers on a destructive path, and why love-based parenting creates lasting change in families. Before we begin, the right bit of inspiration can completely change the trajectory of someone's life. So there's a friend or loved one out there who needs to hear this episode or could use some help to win the day. Share it with them right now. All right, let's win the day with my good mate, Bryan Post. Bryan, great to see you, my friend. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, James. My pleasure. It's such an honor.
Well, a question I like to ask every now and then on this show, but I feel like it takes special significance today, is who was the first person to believe in you?
I would say the first person to believe in me was my mother. And that's my adopted mother who raised me, who I refer to as my mother. And she was probably the person who gave me unconditional love and acceptance and made me feel like there wasn't anything that I couldn't do.
Mm-hmm. And what about your own journey of self-acceptance and self-love?
Well, that's probably been a long process. Being an adopted child, I was adopted at birth. Shortly after birth, I was in foster care for a short period of time, but spending my life working through those issues of self-acceptance and self-worth has just been an ongoing, and you know, I think ultimately it ties into self-growth as an individual and seeking awareness, and it's just a lifelong process.
Mm. And when did you really begin to trust other people?
I don't know that I ever didn't trust other people. I don't know that has ever been a real theme for me at some level. I think that I've always been pretty open in the way I approach other individuals and relationships. And then having adverse experiences probably lead to the lack of trust. But the initial is once I'm in a relationship with a person, with an individual, I don't think that there's a lack of trust. I always see the potential in people. And I think that's probably what helps offset, you know, the lack of trust. It's when you see the potential in someone, you see the best in them and what is your hope for the best, or what you would do if you were in that situation. And so that's kind of how I've always operated.
And can you take us into the reasoning behind the decision that your biological mother gave to put you up for adoption?
Oh, of course. So she met my father. My biological mother was married. She met my father. She was young. She already had 3 children, and her husband was in the military, and he was in Germany. And she thought he had another family and wasn't coming back to Oklahoma. So I was born in Muskogee. So Merle Haggard sang a song, Okie from Muskogee. So I always tell people that's me. I'm an Okie from Muskogee. But she didn't think she didn't think her husband was coming back from Germany. So she met my father and fell in love. He was younger than her, and she got pregnant. The problem is that he then went across town and got her cousin pregnant. And so I actually had a biological brother who was 9 months. We were almost the same age. And when he was 27, he had a genetic heart condition where he was 6'11", his valves couldn't keep up with his growth. And so he died. And so I always think about that just from, you know, the sheer magnitude of the possibilities of who we are. I mean, I could have been the one with that genetic condition. And so once my mother found out that my father had gotten her cousin pregnant, then of course she was heartbroken. And then she realized that she didn't want to be a single mother in Muskogee, Oklahoma in the 70s with 4 kids. She saw that as a long life of struggle. And so she called her husband, told him that she was pregnant. And he said, well, you have to have an abortion. And she said, okay. And he was still in Germany. So when I called her 37 years later, and I said, I'm 51 now, and I met them when I was 37, both her and my biological father. I said, I think in 1973 you had a little boy, and I think that was me. And she said, well, how'd you get my number? And, who are you again? And so I told her, and she said, well, let me call you back. And I said, well, I don't want anything. I'm not a crackhead or anything. I don't need money. I've had a good life. I just want to know who I am and what my roots are. And she said, I'll call you back. And she said, I'll call you back tomorrow. I said, okay. So we hung up. And 30 minutes later, she called me back. She said, baby, you're right. I'm your mom. I've been praying for you every single night. She said, I had to tell my husband. So after all that time, he thought I had been aborted. The only 2 people that knew I existed were my biological mother, name's Wilma, and my Aunt Gloria, her oldest sister. And so she had to tell him. And so when I finally went and met her husband, his name is Arthur, is a beautiful guy. He was the first one out the door, and he gave me a big hug, and he said, I'm so sorry. He said, I just couldn't bear another man's burden. And I said, it's all good,
Wow.
So that's how we got reconnected.
Powerful
and then
stuff.
I met my biological father shortly thereafter. Yeah.
Do you have a strong, as someone who easily could not have been here today in many reasons, do you have a strong opinion on abortion? It seems to be a big issue that people have been talking about the last, 10 or so years in particular.
That's an interesting question. And I have always tended towards pro-choice. I feel like a woman's body is a woman's body, and her decisions, she's ultimately the one who has to live with it. And I don't think I have any position to judge what another individual is going through and what might lead to those circumstances.
And what about the dynamics in the household of when you grew up? Would you describe it as a happy home? Obviously, every home has its challenges. Yeah,
I grew up in World War III. So I had an adopted sister, and she was a year younger than myself. My adopted parents, 2 beautiful people. I loved them dearly, and they loved us dearly, but they came from hard circumstances. They both were children of alcoholics. My mother's father died of a heart attack in front of her when she was 9 years old. So significant trauma. They were both the oldest of sibling groups of 9 and 10. My dad, his father was shot in a bar. My father, he went on to Vietnam, came back with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. For as long as I can remember, he slept with a lamp on next to him because he was afraid of the dark. So he had a tremendous amount of trauma for both of them. And they did the best that they could when it came to raising us, but they didn't understand adopted children. They didn't understand children who have trauma histories, which all adopted children do. They didn't understand their own trauma histories, and they parented us from a very traditional place. So when you combine all that trauma with traditional Black old school parenting, which is usually yelling and hitting, it was not good. And my sister and I were both prone to being sensitive, stress sensitive, fearful children. I did better than she did because my biological mother, she loved being pregnant. And that when we finally reconnected and we did some therapy together, that was one of the things I wanted to know. And I asked people to really explore about themselves is what was your in utero period like? Because those start forming the blueprints of who we are. And she said, I loved being pregnant. And she said, for the first 7 months, she said, I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I ate the right foods, I exercised. And she said, I loved being pregnant. And I knew that intuitively as a professional. However, my sister, my adopted sister, she was exposed to drugs and alcohol in utero. She was 3 months premature. She weighed 3.5 pounds, and she spent the first 3 months of her life in an incubator in the 1970s. And my adopted mom said, when we got you, you were smiling, and when we got your sister, she was crying. And that defined their relationship. So I actually had worse behaviors than my sister, but I was better at hiding them and covering them up and not getting caught. And I also was more socially and emotionally aware, so that I was able to, have friends. I was a leader. I made good grades. I was a good athlete. So I had all these other positive things going for me, even though I was the one who was lying, stealing, drinking, setting fires, slipping out of school, at school sometimes, slipping out of the house at night. My sister, she would get caught doing things because she was emotionally immature and she was developmentally stunted. So my parents were both parentified. As they were the oldest of sibling groups of 10 and 9, they were both parentified, and a parentified individual is someone who never had a childhood. So they're hyper responsible. And both my parents were hyper responsible. So their reaction to my sister's behaviors was to hit and to yell. And that went on for years. That went on till probably I was 16, almost 17. And finally, one day, my sister just got fed up, and she didn't run away. She just left. And my mom said at one point it had gotten so bad that she wanted to hit my sister in the head with a hammer. That's how stressed out she was, and she didn't know what else to do. And so in lieu of knowing what else to do, we usually just do more of what's already not working. And Einstein says the definition of insanity is to do the same thing and expect a different result. But we do that in society with children all the time.
Mm. I guess parents only use the tools that they have available, right?
That's it.
If all you've got is a hammer and you know how to destroy, you just, you hit harder with the hammer.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't know any different. It's just a paradigm. We all have a dominant paradigm for how we were raised. And it's one thing to operate from that paradigm yourself. It's another thing when that paradigm is supported by everyone around you, by the world around you. So if you're a stressed out parent and you're trying not to yell at your child, you're going to have inevitably a family member who's going to say, well, you just need to yell at that kid or hit him or take something away. And then it just gets reinforced in schools and everywhere else. So really it's everyone suffers in that kind of environment. My parents were stressed out and overwhelmed and scared. They didn't know what else to do. But fear, the funny thing about fear, the paradox of fear, is that it makes you do the exact opposite of what you should do.
Yeah. And how did those traumatic moments that you've experienced in your own life shape the way that you go about therapy and your approach today? Oh,
it was tantamount to who I am and to everything that I do and how I see everything. I've been asked oftentimes how I came to do what I do, and I know that God created me to do what I do. From my conception, every experience I've ever had informs me in understanding children and parents in a different way, so that I just look at things from a completely different paradigm. I see everything from a different paradigm. I don't see it from a fear-based paradigm. I see it from a love-based paradigm. And that took a lot of work. That took a lot of self-work. Took a lot of forgiveness of my parents. It took a lot of my own emotional process work. It took a lot of forgiveness of my sister. For years, I blamed her because my parents always blamed her. And then one morning, I had this light bulb moment that it wasn't her fault. She was just doing the best that she could, and no one understood her.
Mm. Can you explain the key differences between adopting a child and fostering one in terms of perhaps legal rights or duration or emotional bonds?
So by and large, most adoptive parents have to foster first, or they have to at least go through foster parent classes, get approved as foster parents. And then once you're approved, it's being called a foster adopt placement. So a child who is in foster care will be placed in a home. And if you're foster adopt, then if that foster care placement goes well, then it can lead to adoption. Now, you could just be a foster parent. And if you're just a foster parent and you don't have intention to adopt, then typically you're just the significant primary care figure of that child for a period of time until either they get reunified with their biological family or an extended family member, or an adoptive placement comes available. So adoption becomes permanent, whereas foster care is temporary.
We had Dr. Jeff Spencer who came on the show, and he and his wife, they had adopted a 10-year-old girl from Colombia who had been through every type of abuse you could possibly imagine. And he's also an Olympian. He said making it to the Olympics is 1,000 times easier than raising an adopted child. How do you feel about that?
He's absolutely right, because making it to the Olympics, though it involves emotion, it is greatly dictated the physical and also the spiritual and the mental. There's so much mental that goes into it. But relationship and raising a child is all emotional. There's very little physical. And there's really not even a lot of mental. It's actually the mental makes it worse, because we overthink situations, or we think we know something about a situation that we don't. It's emotional, and that's what people oftentimes don't realize about parenting and about child raising and just about relationships in general. Relationships are an emotional exchange, much more right hemisphere, much more heart-oriented than head-oriented.
There are so many people out there that need your help. When did you accept the bitter pill that there are just too many people out there who need your help? That you can't help everyone?
I think I was fortunate in knowing that I couldn't help everyone. I was always worked pretty hard just to be really present and work with the people that I could. And then I realized that I could actually help more people when I started doing more group experiences. So when I started doing more group experiences, then I could work with more families in a weekend period of time or shorter period of time. And then I realized I could help even more when I wrote books or when I did lectures. And then I just, I accept that this is my path in life, and my responsibility is to help as many people as I can. I know I can't help everyone, and that would be really depressing and probably make me suicidal if I thought I need to help everyone.
I just love the amplification of everything you're doing, right? Like, you're not sitting there talking to one person per hour or anything like that. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. That's great as well. But you are amplifying your message, and every single family that you help is then able to lead by example and have conversations in their network and their community, and everything can spread from there.
And I tell, especially the parent groups that I speak to, that we might be in a lecture for the day, or we may be in this workshop for this weekend, but it's really not about this day or this weekend, and it's really not about you and your child. It's about your grandchildren, and it's about your great-grandchildren. The work that you're doing today, even your audience listening to your podcast to win the day, this is about legacy work. This means you are the one in your family designated to do something different that no one else in your family may have done. And it is a huge responsibility. And I just love to commend people in my audiences and to honor people for how awesome it is to put yourself forward, to learn something, and to try to do something different than how you may have grown up doing it.
It seems like in the home, one of the biggest things, if not the biggest thing that people struggle with, that parents struggle with, is disciplining their children. Again, they're just not aware of perhaps the skill sets or the tools that they need to be able to do that effectively. What is the most effective way to discipline a child?
Well, I can't say what the most effective way is to discipline a child, but what I can tell you is that discipline starts with our understanding of what discipline is. And I think that that's oftentimes where we start going down the wrong path. We have discipline confused with punishment. Discipline, the definition of discipline is to teach a child. So if you really understand that the definition of discipline is to teach and not to punish, then from the very beginning, you have to reconsider your actions as an adult. And so in order to be an effective disciple, you have to be an effective teacher. In order to be an effective teacher, something very important has to happen. Joseph Ledoux wrote a book years ago called The Emotional Brain, and he's a New York University neuroscientist. And in the book, he states, in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, and our short-term memory is suppressed. So when we become stressed, we are no longer thinking clearly, and we become stressed in a moment, milliseconds. I mean, and oftentimes you become stressed, and you're not even conscious that you're stressed. But as soon as you become stressed, your short-term memory is suppressed. So now if you take that as an adult and you hold on to that for a moment and you reflect on that first for yourself, and you think, okay, when my child's misbehaving, the first thing that's happening is I'm becoming stressed. See, we don't even think about that. We don't think that our children's misbehavior causes us stress, but that's the first thing it does. So then if you realize that as soon as we become stressed, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, and our short-term memory is suppressed, then you understand the first thing you have to do when you become stressed is you have to stop. You have to slow down and you have to breathe. Because the thing that we do as soon as we become stressed is we start holding our breath. And when you start holding your breath, your cortisol increases. Now your short-term memory is suppressed. Now you're not thinking clearly. Now ask yourself, how can I teach effectively? How can I be an effective teacher when I'm stressed out and not thinking clearly? I can't. I'm insane. I'm literally insane. So now let's move over to our 2-year-old or our 5-year-old or our 10-year-old or our 15-year-old. How am I going to teach them a lesson when they're stressed out and their short-term memory is shut down? See, all from this one simple little understanding. So when I understand that my child who's acting out is actually stressed out, my first primary responsibility is to calm myself down and then to help my child calm down. Because until I help my child calm down, until I get their thinking back online, until I help their short-term memory turn back on, they can't learn anything anyway.
And we expect our children to exhibit the right behaviors when they're modeling us, and
That's right.
they don't have a fully developed brain.
That's right.
Yeah, we have a fully developed brain.
That's right.
And we haven't taken the time to have the distinction that, okay, I recognize that my kid is misbehaving. I am stressed. Here is what I need to do. Our instinct is just to lash out or handle something emotionally, or, in many ways you can inflame tensions and make it 1,000 times worse.
I say that when we're stressed out, when it comes to behavior, there are 3 things that we do. We try to control, we try to suppress, or we try to change behavior. Those are 3 things that we try to do. Every parent can understand, and this is hard. This is everything I talk about is simple. It's just really difficult. When you find yourself as a parent trying to control, trying to suppress, or trying to change your behaviors, it's a reflection of your stress. Because what you ultimately want to be able to do is you want to be able to influence behavior. And you influence it. When you're influencing, then you're helping to co-regulate with your child. So you're helping their brain to get in the right place. So then you're creating a completely different dynamic, because we have 3 pathways for emotional expression. And we all have to express emotion because that's how we discharge energy. That's how we move energy. We have attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. But how many of us grew up in homes where we could roll our eyes or huff and puff? No. How many of us grew up in homes where we could express how we felt? No. How many of us grew up in homes where we could actually have behaviors? We couldn't. So if you can't express to your attitudes, and you can't express to your feelings, and you can't express to your behaviors, what are your other options? There are only 2, anger and depression. Anger and depression have to come out through behaviors. So then we spend our entire existence trying to suppress attitudes and feelings and behaviors. In the process, we're not teaching children how to have any kind of healthy expressions. When in reality, as we become adults, how do we express our upset, attitudes, and feelings? The most popular we all roll our eyes, we all talk back, we all cuss, we mumble under our breaths. But when it comes to our children, we don't want them to do that. So we grow them up asking them to do something different than what we do ourselves. And that's another reflection of our own societal insanity, which is just fear and stress.
Can we do a scenario here, like a basic scenario? I'd love to see how you would actually handle this. You can come up with a scenario, or we could do something simple like a kid, it's time to go to bed, and they just say, nope, I'm not going to bed. Like, how would you, obviously a parent's instinct would be, maybe not in these words, but get your ass to bed. It's time to go to sleep. We've had a big day.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that, because that is such the traditional instinct, right? Because as soon as the parent says it's time to go to bed and the kid says no, the parent immediately gets stressed. So then they control, suppress, or change. And that usually the controlling is get your ass to bed. Now, like I said, instead of the parent taking a deep breath, registering what the child said, realizing that all of us struggle with transition, not saying anything to the child, but going back to the room and just waiting. Just waiting. What if you just wait? What if you say to your child, hey, it's time for bed, and then you just walk in the other room? Your fear is going to tell you that they're not going to go to bed, especially after you hear them say no. But what happens is that anytime we encounter a novel event, we perceive it as a threat until deemed otherwise. That's Bruce Perry. So anytime we have to transition, we immediately perceive it as a threat until deemed otherwise. So when I walked in your studio, my brain automatically said threat because I'm in a new environment. So it took me a period of time unconsciously before I relaxed and realized that I was not at risk. So when a child is watching their favorite television show and it's nighttime, then this is in good case scenarios. It's nighttime. Parent comes in with no warning and says, hey, time for bed. You are asking that child whose brain is not fully developed and mature, who doesn't have a full ability to regulate their brain, you're asking them to make an immediate transition. Adults can't even do it. Adults can't even do it. So then when the child doesn't reflect that transition by their behavior, then you immediately say, hey, or if they say no, because that's what we do when we perceive something as a threat until deemed otherwise, we say no. Because that's the immediate reaction. An oppositional defiant child is a scared child. So when a child says no, it's because in their brain, they're immediately moved into stress, which means they immediately move into freeze. So that's the no. Now, if you realize that, you don't even say anything. You just back away. You go in the other room, and this is what I like to encourage parents to do. Practice, investigate, explore, ask what if. You go in the room, they don't do anything. You come back. Now you're breathing. You're a little less stressed. You're not overwhelmed. You don't have all those old parenting stories telling you, make that child go to bed right now. Or if they don't go to bed right now, they're not going to sleep. They're going to be up till 2:00 in the morning, and then they're going to keep me up, and then I'm not going to get enough sleep, and then I'm probably going to get tired on the way to work, and then I'm going to probably get a ticket, or I'm going to run a stoplight, and then I'm going to be late. All these fear-based things that happen. When you can calm all that down, you go back to your child and say, hey, babe, time for bed, sweetheart. What story you want to read? I'm going to come in here and lay down with you and get ready, get your story ready. So you go through that process. Child's now relaxed. You give them a little physical affection. I love you. Walk in the room, give them space. They'll turn the TV off. They're not going to sit there and watch it. Now, what if they do? What if they just sit there and watch it? You know what? Go to bed. And the next night, see, this is how you break patterns. You do something different. The next night, instead of waiting till 9:00 to turn the TV off, you say at 8:00, hey, honey, last night, I noticed that 9:00 was really late. And I know it's really late because when I asked you to cut it off, you couldn't cut it off, which tells me I let you watch it too long, which means you were too stressed. And I'm really sorry for putting you in that environment and creating that. And I don't want to be a bad parent. So tonight, we're going to turn it off at 8:00. I know it'll be okay. 9:00 is just too long. We'll try 9:00 another time. Repetition. It's called taking responsibility as a parent. Mm-hmm. See, we're too reactive. And we're reactive because we get stressed and we're scared. And we never just slow down.
And when those things happen, like I just look at my own household, my wife and I, we're both exhausted from, a very long day of working very, very hard. The kids come back from school, they're very tired. So emotions are high, energy is low. It's difficult, but allowing yourself a little bit of space. I love that. And it's not about the TV or whatever it is. Like, does the kid associate that with perhaps not feeling loved or perhaps not feeling safe, or is it about the TV? Like, how do you feel about it when a tantrum happens? And my instinct with a lot of this stuff, because I have young kids, I just naturally think about it more from younger kids rather than, I know your seven kids are growing.
Actually, that's excellent, because anytime we stress, we regress. So anytime you stress emotionally, you regress to an earlier stage. So a parent who's listening to this could be dealing with this same challenge with a 15-year-old, where you're dealing with it with a 5-year-old or a 2-year-old, where you're dealing with it closer to its actual emotional age. They don't see that the 15-year-old is actually regressing to a 5-year-old or a 2-year-old. So now they're addressing the 15-year-old, and it's really not a 15-year-old because emotionally it's a 5 or 2-year-old. So it's not, I won't say it's a matter of not being loved, because first of all, television and now cell phones, what we don't take into consideration is that these devices have been created in a way to give us maximum dopamine release. Dopamine is a hormone that feels really good. It's really the hormone that underlies most drug seeking and most compulsive behaviors. You're looking for dopamine. And you also get to a flow state when you're watching TV or you're looking at your phone. And that's why, you start you're watching a good show and you're looking at the clock and you're like, dang it, it's almost over. And it's over. And this is as an adult. Imagine for a kid, you're like, dang it, because it feels so good watching it. You're lost in it. And then imagine someone comes along and says, hey, turn it off. Oh my God, your brain it crashes. The pain of turning it off. And that's just because you're in a moment of peak neurochemistry, right? That's independent of everything else. It's just at that moment of being tied in to that electronic device and the way it's manipulating your brain feels so good. It's just really hard to cut that off. Now, if you're an adopted child or you're a foster child and that escalates, now you could get into feelings of being abandoned or being rejected, because when we become stressed, depending on the level of stress, we drop into different levels in our brainstem. Trauma is stored at the base of your brainstem. So when you're in a really peak level of stress, your brainstem is activated. That's where your core personality traits are. And if you've experienced any trauma, that's where the trauma is stored too. So it's all intertwined. So depending on what those early experiences are, you may have all kinds of messages or stories that get triggered during just that little bitty moment of time to turn the television off. But I would say by and large, all adverse childhood experiences aside, just getting off the television is difficult.
Just those two things there of like emotional regulation and managing the transition. It's an absolute game changer. I love it. I think it's so important. We'll be back with the show shortly. I've got a quick question for you. Are you living up to your potential? It's a question that shapes your family, your business, and your overall happiness every single day. That's why I'm excited to introduce the Win the Day quiz. Head over to winthedayquiz.com right now, answer a few thought-provoking questions, and you'll instantly discover how well you're performing relative to your true potential. And here's the exciting part for our Win the Day family. As a fan of the show, you'll receive a personalized and absolutely free action plan to help you win the day every day. Now, just imagine how transformational the results will be when you consistently show up as the best version of yourself in every aspect of your life. Don't miss out. Take the Win the Day quiz now by visiting winthedayquiz.com or click the link in the show notes. All right, let's get back to the show. Should the approach to discipline be different if the parent is managing violent or aggressive behavior toward another sibling in the household?
So that's interesting. A lot of parents, in fact, I just did a webinar on aggression recently. And I think that there are always two really important things that we have to look at when we are dealing with aggressive or violent children. And then if you're talking about towards another sibling, now you're talking about sibling rivalry, which is a different dynamic. But the first thing you have to look at with aggression, just by itself, is do you have any history of violence? Any history in the past experience of any kind of domestic violence or any kind of physical abuse as a adult? Did you have any experience with that as a child? Because if you did, those experiences are still stored in your brainstem. So any aggressive energy is going to attract your own past experience, which is then going to cause you to feel overwhelmed or anxious or maybe even aggressive yourself. So you really have to look at that. Number two, severe behavior is always predictable. So when a child is prone towards aggressive behavior, you have to stop waiting until they are acting out and start investigating to when their window of tolerance starts getting smaller to begin with, before they ever get to the aggression, because they are giving you signals all along the way. But a lot of times, because our amygdala only focuses on the negative, your amygdala is only waiting for the negative thing to occur. And when that occurs, then you get hijacked. But if you will pay attention to your child, what their window of tolerance is, how much stimulation they can deal with before they hit that peak state, then a lot of times you can interrupt the aggression, and you can interrupt it with eye contact. You can interrupt it with a smile. You can interrupt it with a hug. You can interrupt it with a, hey, are you okay? You can interrupt it with, we're going to be all right. So that's with aggression. Now, the first thing you mentioned was siblings. First of all, we have to realize that there's sibling rivalry. But unconsciously, especially when sibling rivalry is intense, unconsciously, sibling rivalry is an unconscious fight for survival. One sibling sees the other sibling as a threat to their life. So one sibling sees the other sibling as taking the parents away. So unconsciously, the one sibling says, I have to kill my sibling to survive. And that's just a primal instinct. Although they don't say it, they're not going to do that. That's the energy. That's why it's so intense, because they perceive that sibling as taking the parent away. And I can't allow that to happen, because the parent is my source of survival, love, security, everything. You're my everything. I have to kill him. I have to. I have no choice. So then that's why it gets so intense. So I always say to parents, go to both children, bring them into you, look at them with all seriousness, and you say, you do not have to try to kill your little brother. You do not have to try to kill your little sister. There's enough of me for both of you. I love you both. And it makes me sad, and it makes me scared when the two of you fight. If you need something, you ask me. I am here. So you make that statement and be very firm about it. And then after that, you have to pay attention to their window of tolerance for one another and interaction. See, they have a window of tolerance for how much, we all have a window of tolerance for how much stress we can handle. When that window of tolerance gets too small, we can't tolerate any more stress. We can't tolerate any more sensory input. And the thing is that just like peer interaction, sibling interaction, the physiology of that is the same as stress. So when two kids are playing together, they are literally stressing themselves out. And so that window of tolerance is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. At a certain point, when they get stressed, they're going to go into that brainstem, they're going to regress, and that's where that regressed behavior is going to come from. And that's the root of sibling rivalry.
Very interesting. How much information should a prospective foster family have about the kid that might be coming into their family, especially in the context of perhaps they've had an extremely violent history, which might impact the decision to proceed with everything?
That's an excellent question. That is an excellent question. And the reason I say it's an excellent question is because by and large, foster parents aren't told anything, which is a problem. Because then they say something or do something, or they miss the window of tolerance with the child, and then the child hits a peak state, becomes violent, and then the foster parents completely caught off guard, and they don't want to do this anymore. You have to balance that against the foster parent who's not told anything to the foster parent who is told everything. And you have to face the potential that by telling them everything, they may actually say, this is not for me. This is not I'm not going to be good with an angry child. They need an opportunity to make that choice. And I believe that the more honest we can be, we be honest with them about the child's history, but help them to be honest about their own history. Because when you help them to be honest about their own history, they can make a more informed, heartfelt decision about the children that they bring into their homes. And traditionally, our foster parent trainings are poor. They do not educate foster parents at the depth of themselves and their own self-understanding that they need to parent traumatized children, nor do they really share the depth of some of the pain that these children come from. And you don't even have to give a child specific story. I can just give you a horror story and tell you exactly what a child's going to do. And now let's walk through that. And you decide if you can handle that or not.
So much of it sounds like it comes down to expectations. I feel like that's a big thing for all of us in life. If we go in there expecting it to be easy and it's hard, we're like, cool, I'm out. But if we go in there expecting it to be extremely difficult, like this is going to be by far the toughest thing that you've ever done times 100. It very much reminds me of the journey of entrepreneurship in that sense. Like launching a business is extremely difficult, and there's no way to know just how difficult that journey is until you walk through it. And then I can only imagine this would be probably 100 times harder than that journey as well. Is it better to make it sound in terms of expectations, to say like, I know you have this idea of a picturesque family and that you might get there soon. This is going to be by far the most difficult thing that you've ever gone through. Here are some of the reasons why that's the case. And then that way the expectations are a lot. Anytime that they get that moments of positivity and that it isn't as bad as they seem, they might be like, wow, this isn't as bad as we've seemed, and it feels better by comparison. Yeah,
and I can set you up from the very beginning with that by just saying, by asking you, what's the most difficult thing you've ever gone through in your life? Let's spend some time with your feelings around that. How did that feel? What was that like? What were the sensations like? Because when you have this child in your home and they're really stressed and acting out, that's the feeling that's going to get stirred up. So when that feeling gets stirred up, what are you going to do with it? Because you've got to be able to regulate that feeling so you can allow that child to work through their feelings, because that's the only way we help children heal through their traumas, is by being able to create a present, supportive environment so that they can work through the energy of the experiences that they've had without us trying to control, suppress, and change them.
What's the most important skill to teach a child?
Breathing.
That seems to be a common theme of experts that we've had on this show, is that, breathing, teaching a kid to regulate their own emotions as young as possible.
I think it's more important to teach the adults.
Yeah. So the most important thing to teach a child, most important skill to teach a child is the adult itself.
That's right. The most important skill for a child to learn is what they have to be able to learn from an adult. And if an adult cannot model breathing and therefore cannot teach it, then a child's not going to be able to really grasp it at the level that they need. But I believe our inability to breathe is the single greatest barrier to any relationship challenge, because we are so conditioned to hold our breaths. If we can breathe, and Bruce Lee actually says the ability to breathe, the ability to remain calm is the key to mastery. And that is because when you can breathe, you can keep your thinking open and you can keep your short-term memory turned on. So in that moment, you know you're not going to die. When you stop breathing, you are held hostage to the feeling that you must survive. So we have surviving and we have thriving. When you're not breathing, you're surviving. And in a survival state, you can't be present and you can't truly be understanding of another person's experience. When you can breathe, you can keep yourself present. You can keep yourself with the greatest likelihood of being able to understand and therefore being able to support. And like Saint Francis said, to understand before being asked to be understood.
So we can't expect a child to acquire a skill that we haven't been able to acquire ourselves.
100%. Does that not seem like common sense?
It does. And it does, right? Yes, 100%. And I think what's so interesting is that it's a bit like people wanting a quick fix. They want a magic bullet to something. It's a lot easier to say, here is my child who has these behavioral issues. There is something wrong with them. Let me fix it, rather than taking a good look in the mirror and saying, no, perhaps I haven't acquired the most necessary skill that is needed in terms of my child's own development.
It's because we live in a fear-based society. A fear-based society always looks for a quick fix, because the amygdala is always looking to control, suppress, and change. Because the amygdala is your fear receptor in your brain. So anytime it sees a problem, it just wants to get rid of the problem.
And you mentioned there being conditioned to hold our breath. Where does that come from? What do you mean by that?
The moment we become stressed, so that comes from Herbert Benson, 1970s Harvard physiologist. He wrote a book called The Relaxation Response, and he actually discovered it through his research with transcendental meditation, that the first thing that we do when we become stressed is we start holding our breath. And we hold our breath. That momentary holding your breath causes that cortisol to spike. And then what that does is cause a cascade of stress hormones, including adrenaline, to put you in survival. So you have trillions of cells in your body. The moment you become stressed, all the cells in your body constrict into survival. So then we start taking really short, ineffective breaths. And that's why from time to time you can be going on through the day and then all of a sudden you just go, it's because you were holding your breath and you weren't even conscious of it. And it's just an automatic response, that reaction. I always say the difference between a reaction and a response is a reaction is automatic and it's unconscious. A response requires consciousness, requires thought.
How do you motivate an unmotivated teenager?
Slowing down and seeking a point of connection based on what they are interested in and building relationship from that point. Because the first thing that happens when we say a teenager is unmotivated, it creates all these stress reactions within ourselves, especially if you grow up like old school, like I did, where laziness, we call it unmotivated now. Back in the day, you just called it being lazy. That has so many negative connotations. And so typically what we want to do is we want to threaten, force, or cajole a child. And really what we have to do is we have to slow down, because there's all kinds of reasons why a child may not be motivated, because we all respond to stress in one of two different ways. We become hyper-aroused and aggressive, or we become hypo-aroused and shut down. Now, there are 2/3 more boys than girls that are hyper-aroused. 2/3 more girls than boys that are hypo-aroused, but you never know. Everyone's a little bit different. So an unmotivated child is just a hypo-aroused child. When they're stressed, they just shut down. I mean, I have a 16-year-old and she is like a turtle when it is time to transition to school. She has to get up 3 hours early. Now, thank God that she gets up on her own to get herself ready. But after 3 hours, it's time to go to school and she's still the last one out of the house. It's not because she's lazy. It's because she has a hypo-aroused sensory system. So it takes her a lot of work to get to moving to make that motion happen.
I think this is good timing now for this question that I wanted to ask you. How do you feel about this quote? Children are likely to live up to what you believe of them. Children are likely to live up to what you believe of them. Essentially talking about, like labels, good or bad. If you call a kid lazy, they're going to identify with being lazy and start exhibiting more lazy behaviors.
It reminds me of something that Deepak Chopra says. He says that you cannot prevent the future from happening, but you can influence the future from the present. And so really, when you say that children live up to what you believe in, and what we're actually talking about is the energy and the vibration we sow into the moment. So if you have a negative belief about a child, then what you're actually doing is creating a negative vibration around that child. That negative vibration, that frequency that you're creating is the dominant frequency that child's going to have to dial into. Their own brains are going to dial into that frequency. Well, if you're generating as an adult, if you're generating a low frequency in your belief of a child, how could they possibly have a high frequency belief of themselves? So that there's so many things, and I become more and more kind of, I won't even say obsessed, but really curious about the words we use, because the words we use reflect our internal vibration. And that internal vibration creates the frequencies that we live on. And so when we say things like children will ascend to the level that you believe of them, then we're saying that children have the greatest likelihood to achieve whatever frequency we as adults create, which is obvious because we are the adults. We have the stronger vibratory system. So I'm a big believer in that.
There's a difference between a unmotivated teenager versus one who is on a destructive path. How would you intervene for a teenager who's on a bit of a destructive path?
It's probably not going to be a great deal different. Here's the big challenge. The challenge with the teenager who's on the destructive path is that they create a lot more fear and stress for us as adults. So we have to face these destructive behaviors, and we have to face that internally. And so when you see your child running away and doing drugs and being rolling with the bad crowd, you want to control that. And so then what typically happens when we want to control, suppress, and change is we actually start creating the energy that repels the child even more. When in fact, we have to challenge ourselves in that moment to get even more loving, to get even more joyful, to get even more peaceful, more accepting, more understanding, because we actually want to create an energy that attracts the child back to us, which brings them out of the destructive path. But we just do the exact opposite when we get scared. And it's so hard. It's so hard. But the question is, how can you love your child more? Your child's on a destructive path. Yes, they're on their path, which you can't control anyway. You can influence it. How can you love them more? Just ask that question. What can I do to love my child more? And don't worry about the destructive path. I say that. How hard is that? Oh, he's saying you should let kids use drugs. No, I'm not saying that. He's saying you should let kids steal cars. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're going to make that choice anyway. They're already making it. The real question is, how can you love them more while they're doing it? Because that's going to give you the greatest opportunity, because relationship is the single most important thing, because we are biologically engineered. Every cell, every synapse, every dendrite is biologically engineered for relationship. Once you lose relationship, you lose everything.
Such a great reframe of that. How can I love them more? So many scenarios where that's just applicable. I feel like they could almost have that written on a Post-it note.
It's so hard though. It's
exactly,
so hard.
Exactly. Yeah, but it's so powerful. I feel like in marriage that can be really good as well. Like how can I love them more? And there is only so much of your kids' behavior that you can control, especially when they're a young adult and they might be living at home, but they're a lot more independent. Maybe they've got a driver's license and they're out a lot. You can't be watching them 24/7. And by doing that, you're going to be repelling them because it shows that you're not trusting them, and perhaps they might feel like you're not loving them even though you can. So how can I love them more can bring them back in when they're ready to be brought back in. Obviously, there are some very difficult scenarios where that might not be possible because of circumstances, but yeah.
You really have to look at that when you are trying to control and suppress and change your child's behaviors through whatever kind of traditional ways that we normally do it. And you say you're doing that because you love them. That behavior has nothing to do with love. That behavior is all driven by fear. And see, and that's one of our biggest challenges as parents in our society, is that as kids, we were raised experiencing fear disguised as love. And so when our parents yelled or hit or threatened or shamed and they said, I'm doing this because I love you, that's not true. None of that is love. That's all fear. So you have to really ask yourself as a parent, is what I'm doing creating more stress and fear, or is it creating more love and understanding and relationship?
Carl Jung talks about this idea that the greatest threat to the child is the unlived life of the parent. And you can see it there. There are times you're trying to control kids. It's because you might have acted up when you were a teenager and you're trying to stop your kids from going down that path, even though experience really is the best teacher, if not the only teacher a lot of the time as well.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What are the most common signs of unresolved trauma in children that parents often overlook?
Hyperactivity is one. So common, so easily diagnosed as reactive attachment disorder. Problems with sleep, problems with peer interactions, anxiety, food issues, sensory overwhelm. You know, there's so many things, so many symptoms. But just think, what in my child's behavior is a manifestation of stress? If my child is acting out, and I'm just going to say could, I believe it to be 100%, an acting out child is a stressed out child. So whatever that behavior is, whatever that trauma may have been, because there can be all kinds. You're not going to know what they all are. Child's never going to know. Most adults don't even know all the stressors and traumas we've experienced. And trauma is any stressful event that's prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. And when you haven't had an opportunity to express, process, and understand it, that's the difference between a short-term stressful experience versus a long-term, potentially life and brain-altering traumatic experience when you haven't been able to express, process, and understand it. The significance is that when your child is acting out, it's because they're stressed out. And you got to help regulate that stress. And if you can help regulate that stress sufficiently and effectively, you can teach them how to regulate their own emotional upheaval. And over time, help them grow into the awareness of themselves and help them work through whatever traumas and upset emotions that may come from that.
For a parent who's struggling with their own trauma, what can they do to start the healing process?
Oh, I like to just, obviously therapy, people always recommend it.
Like talk therapy in particular? So that's the thing. I feel like there's so many limitations to therapy, even though, it's better to talk to someone than it is to not talk to anyone. And the limitations is that usually when you've experienced trauma, we just want to talk about it. But trauma is emotional. And the only way that you can truly get to the root of trauma is through emotional expression. The language of trauma is emotional. The language of trauma is not verbal. So I like to encourage people to journal. I like to encourage them to take time to go in a quiet room, close your eyes, think about a painful experience, breathe into your body, and cry it out, yell it out, put sound to it, put feeling to it, and just let it out. And as you let it out, and the more you get comfortable with that, once you're done, and I know that the fear is that, well, you're going to have a nervous breakdown or, you're never going to stop crying, because I've had adults say that, well, if I start crying, I'll never stop. That's just a fear, because usually it lasts 5 to 10 minutes. Once that's done and you've experienced that energetic discharge, that emotional discharge, then you'll think about that experience. And the process of healing trauma is to take something that was unconscious and make it more conscious. That's the process. It's no more complicated than that. You take an unconscious experience, something you don't want to think about, something you don't want to feel, but is always impacting you. And you breathe into it and you feel it and you think about it and you process it and you express it. And then you bring it up to a conscious level and you just keep processing it and you understand it and then you let it go. For those who have been adopted or a part of a foster family, do you encourage them to seek out their biological parents, even though they have no idea what might be waiting for them on the other side?
I think that's all really individually based. I had a psychotherapy mentor a long time ago told me that 80%, there was some research that cited that 80% of adoption reunifications with biological parents end in lifelong depression. And I've since then, and that was 30 years ago when he told me that, I have found that to be more the case than not. I think that a situation, for me, it's different because I'm pretty psychologically sophisticated anyway, and wasn't expecting anything and didn't need anything. A lot of times, and I work with adopted children all the time and adults, a lot of times you're still looking for something. In fact, I just talked to an adult the other day who had an unfortunate reunion experience because she was looking for that parent. She was looking for that mother, and that mother doesn't exist because that little girl only exists within her emotionally. And so it just depends. I think you have to go into it with eyes wide open.
For parents out there who are extremely motivated to be the best parents they can be, is there any tips that they can focus on that we haven't really covered yet today?
I love the question, and it's always worth repeating. The first thing they can do is really work on the process of self-understanding, really understanding who they are, where they come from, What was your birth history like? Because your birth history, John Bowlby in the 50s said our first 3 years of life established the blueprints for all of our future social and emotional relationships. Well, after the 90s, which was the decade of the brain, we know that it actually starts at conception. As early as the 4th week, your ears start to develop. So by the second trimester, you're already thinking and processing in utero. So those are blueprints. In Nadine Burke Harris's book, The Deepest Well, she cites that in the first year of life, we form 1 million neural connections per second. Per second. In the first year of life, the brain is exploding. And as the brain is exploding, it is consuming information and data. And so we really have to understand that our first 0 to 5 years of life establishes so much of who we are as adults now. And so when parents are seeking that deep self-understanding, having an understanding of who you are originally as a human being is so important. And then just understanding your own fears and your own stressors. I believe that that's one of the greatest gifts we can give our children is our own self-understanding.
Well said. And last question before the rocket round. On your best day, what's an affirmation that you would write on a flashcard that you could show yourself on your worst day?
I'm good enough. You are good enough.
Well, let's now move into the Win the Day rocket round. 10 questions for some quick answers. You up for this one, Bryan?
Okay.
Number 1, what quote inspires you the most?
Hold on. Just hold on, man. Yeah.
Number 2, morning coffee or evening wine?
Morning coffee.
Number 3, what's one bit of advice you would give your 18-year-old self?
Dream bigger.
Number 4, what book do you gift the most or that contributed most to the mindset you have today?
Probably Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but one of the ones I've got 4 of them in my backpack right now is called U Squared by Price Pritchard.
Yeah.
I love it.
Absolutely. Classic. Number 5, was there a vulnerability you once hid within that became your superpower?
Oh, fear of rejection and abandonment.
Wow, that's a really good one. Number 6, what's one thing you've learned about failure?
It's the best thing.
Number 7, if you could sit on a park bench and have a conversation with someone alive or dead, who would it be?
Probably Malcolm X.
Number 8, what tool or resource best helps you run your life or your business?
Does cigar count as a tool?
Yes.
My notebook. I love carrying around my little notebook.
So you prefer handwritten stuff than digital?
I do.
Yeah. Awesome. And number 9, share one thing on your bucket list.
Oh, one thing on my bucket list is that I want to write a legacy book for my family that is a post-principles book that gets passed down for generations.
And last question, number 10, what's one thing you do to win the day?
Man, there's so many things I feel like I do. I cold plunge. I read first thing in the mornings. I pray. I go slow first thing in the morning.
Yeah. So just those essentials as part of the routine?
Oh, yeah.
Help you show up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Love it. There are a bunch of ways to connect with Bryan, and we'll link to all of these in the show notes. You can follow him on Instagram at Bryan Post Official, visit his website at bryanpost.com, and grab a free copy of his best-selling adoption parenting book, From Fear to Love, at feartolovebook.com. Again, all that and more will be linked in the show notes. Brother, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, James.
Thanks for joining me on another episode of the Win the Day podcast. We want to hear your thoughts on what we covered today, so drop a comment on the YouTube version of this episode with your favorite takeaway, any questions you have, or what actions you'll be taking as a result of what was shared in this episode. And if you found value in the Win the Day podcast, leave a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You'll find a link to both of those in the show notes. It'll only take you a few seconds, and more ratings really helps other people discover the show so they can get the mindset upgrade they need, and we can bring more winners into the Win the Day movement. That's all for this episode. Get out there and win the day. Until next time, onwards and upwards, always.